Hey, welcome back to another episode of Keepin' Cozy. Today I'm speaking with Irish philosopher and professor Richard Kearney. Professor Kearney was my professor of philosophy at Boston College, but outside of that he's taught at the Sorbonne in France as well as the University College of Dublin in Ireland. Today we speak about the philosophy of the internet and the importance of unimportant majors. Thanks for your time in watching, and if you like it, please be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Enjoy! Thank you. Well, thank you for coming to the podcast, Professor. How have you been keeping?
Very good, and it's a pleasure to be here.
So I wanted to start by just having you walk through your career a little bit. I know it's been very distinguished, but for some of our viewers and listeners who may not have, come across your work before.
Well, I began my studies in Ireland at University College Dublin, where I became very interested in European philosophy in particular, the sort of contemporary philosophy of imagination, metaphor, symbol, myth. And this took me actually to study first with my master's degree with Charles Taylor in Canada, in McGill University, and then from there to Paris, where I worked with contemporary French philosophers like Paul Ricoeur and Emmanuel Levinas and Jacques Derrida on my doctorate, and then published a number of works on the philosophy of imagination and applied it to various disciplines, including literature, film, politics, and of course, naturally, philosophy itself.
Yeah.
So more recently, I have sort of developed the philosophy of imagination in the direction of an interpretation of religious symbols and practices and narratives, and more recently still towards what I call carnal hermeneutics, or a philosophy of touch.
Yeah, and that's definitely what I want to talk to you about a little bit later in the podcast. But I'd love to talk a little bit about just how you started to become established as a philosopher and as a professor.
Well, I started teaching, first of all, in Dublin. After I finished my doctorate in Paris, I returned to Dublin. I'm a native of Ireland, and taught there for actually 21 years before moving to Boston, where I currently hold a chair of philosophy, the Seelig Chair of Philosophy in Boston College.
Yeah. And then I have a question just for, viewers who may be interested in entering academia. How competitive is it towards becoming a professor, a full professor? Is that something that is a lifetime aspiration, or is it something that, you can still have a successful career in academia without it?
You can. It was much easier in the past, and indeed even in my day, to get academic positions. Nowadays, there's a big emphasis on sort of practical subjects in the United States, largely due to the fact that, one pays for one's education. Unlike Europe, where I grew up, I got my PhD free, working with the best philosophers in the world in Paris at the time in the 1970s and 80s. But that's different here. So, a lot of young people taking degrees nowadays will do philosophy with something else: marketing, business, computer science, education, something practical and vocational, because the academic positions are actually very competitive nowadays. But my own belief is that to do philosophy prepares you for everything and for nothing. You will never regret it. And, to have an MA, even an advanced degree, a master's or a PhD in philosophy, is, I think, something very coveted. Even people going into Microsoft or going to publishing or the diplomatic corps, there's politics, civil service. A degree in philosophy is very, very highly considered, even though you won't be doing philosophy per se, but it's considered that you'll be pretty all round in your approach to your subject. You'll have a certain wisdom about it. You'll be aware of, the history of ideas, the history of culture, in a way that somebody just studying a very, practical, technical subject might not be.
Yeah, and some of the, some of our guests and some of the most, accomplished people in tech especially have all, cited philosophy as their, the major they would tell their kids to focus on if they were to go to college. Or, Peter Thiel, who's a huge Facebook investor, was a philosophy major, as well as this guy we had on the last episode of the podcast, Jim Rogers, studied philosophy at Oxford, and he became a very successful investor. So I'm sure that there is practical, uses towards this somewhat people talk about how impractical the philosophy major is, but yeah, there is practical uses.
Well, it's precisely because it's ostensibly impractical, useless, non-productive. I mean, this even comes up and going back, 2,500 years to Plato. At the same time, that frees you to question things in a liberal manner, in a free manner. And just to mention my own country, the last 3 presidents of Ireland have PhDs in philosophy. The current president of France, Macron, has a PhD in philosophy, studied with the same philosophers I did, Paul Ricoeur. So it's an interesting connection that the most impractical sometimes turns out to be, in practice, very, very effective and very transformative.
Yeah, and the number one major for people who are in the 1% in the United States economically is actually art history, which I found to be pretty interesting.
Yeah, equally relevant and impractical. But again, the cultured mind. I mean, when the university was being founded, Archbishop Henry Newman wrote a book called The Idea of the University. This was, the Irish and British universities at the time in the 19th century. And he said there were 2 kinds of approaches. There were what he called the artes serviles, kind of what we would call the natural sciences nowadays, the practical sciences, the hard sciences, and then the artes liberales, and they were the impractical sciences, what we today would call the arts. But he said you actually need both, and one cannot, in spite of the emphasis in our contemporary culture on the industrial and the technological and the economic and the mercantile, he said it's a grave error to think you can dispense with the liberal arts. The humanities.
And
they make us human. They make us humane.
No, and I couldn't agree more. I mean, I was a marketing and philosophy guy, so I, hopefully will, follow the track of these great philosophers we've mentioned.
Well, but I kind of now running a podcast.
And hopefully it becomes, a big podcast. But going back to specifically, your teaching stuff, how have you found teaching during COVID to be?
Mixed, and in fact my teaching has been mixed in what they call hybrid. That is a mix of in-person and Zoom. My big class is Zoom, and my smaller grad class of sort of 10 graduate doctoral students is and master's students is in person, but with masking and social distance and so on and so forth. Now I personally prefer the in-person. But I obviously see the absolute necessity for big class to be, to be long distance, as they call it, online. And there are certain advantages to that, in that I can record on Panopto and Canvas my lectures, and then the student, instead of having to come to class on a certain day, can listen to it at any time during the week and then post their reflection at the end of it. And so there are advantages to, certainly for a big class, having that sort of freedom. And then I check in with the students synchronously, as it's called, in a live Zoom session once a week, where they can ask questions about their reading. So it works pretty well. But nothing replaces the in-person class, where I hope once the vaccine comes into process, comes on stream, that we will get back to live classes. Although I think there'll always be an element of Zoom from now on. That's the culture we live in. But it's the accidents that can occur when you're in a live class with people. It's the reading of faces. It's the intonation, the silences, the chemistry between different people in the class that sometimes go unknown. That's what I call carnal hermeneutics. The body picks it up. Teaching is embodied as much as it is mental. We are not disincarnate beings, even though we live in what I call an increasingly excarnate age. But we're born to be in a body, and so it's important to preserve in our culture a commons of the body as well as a connectivity of the World Wide Web. We need both.
And that's why I wanted to have you on the podcast specifically, because I think that, you've written a book about touch and the importance of touch and the importance of being a little bit more of a physically connected community. But we're now
Yes.
living in a pandemic, which firstly, we need to be, physically distant, socially distant. But then also, do you think this is exasperating like the phenomena that you kind of touch on with, how we are moving away from being a personal society to an online, internet, digital society?
Yes and no. Yes, in the evident sense that we're obviously working more from home, we're communicating more online than ever before. But in so doing, I think we have become aware, by virtue of the crisis, of the absence of touch, more aware of touch. It's like, what Martin Heidegger says in the Existential say about death. It's when you become aware of death as the possibility of your non-being that you actually come to appreciate being, and that you raise the question of being. There's sort of a tradition in a lot of wisdom traditions and cultures that it's learning to die before you die that actually enables you to live well. So a lot of the initiation rites, mystery rites, religious rites, mythological rites were actually about going into the dark, what the Aborigines call the walkabout, what the Christian mystics and the Jewish mystics call the dark night of the soul, what the Islamic, sages and the Sufis called, fana, the annihilation, that through an appreciation of non-being, the existential would say your own personal non-being as that which will happen when you die, but which is happening all the time because we're always being towards death. That actually is not morbid necrophilia or nihilism. It's a way of becoming more aware of being. So in the pandemic, when we were deprived of touch, we suddenly became aware more than ever before of what maybe before we took for granted, was how much we actually need to hug. How when we touch a doorknob, 20 people have touched that doorknob before you don't even notice it. How suddenly when you have to be 9 feet away from people, you realize how close you are to people most of the time, and what an important need that is. And tragically for many, those in nursing homes and so on who were dying and they weren't able to be with their family, and they had to come and look, their family and loved ones had to look at them through a window. But the longing for touch, and even the healthcare workers would say this, and when people were dying of COVID, they would cry out for touch. The most important thing that the nurses and doctors could do was actually to touch them with the protective gear and so on, but to actually hold them and touch them. So I think that's very important, how we became aware more than ever before of the importance of the tactile in our lives.
Yeah, and just playing off of that, you have this, I think you're the first person I've heard who's mentioned this idea of excarnation. And it's kind of a play on the idea of incarnation, which is image becoming flesh. Mm-hmm. Excarnation is flesh becoming image. So could you talk a little bit about that, with also, paying respect to the fact that some people may not understand the philosophical idea of image?
Well, philosophical idea of image is not that different from the way we use image. That is to say, it is presenting something in its absence. Right? Yeah. I imagine my friend in Dublin. I'm in Boston. I imagine my friend in Dublin. My friend Sean is present to my mind's eye, and even in a way that can be very moving. If I'm missing my friend, I could weep. If I think of his sense of humor, I might laugh. It can really affect me. But it is in and through an image that I have that, what Sartre calls a magical incantation or invocation of an absence through a presence. So that goes right back to the beginning of time, when, the hunter-gatherers went to a cave and painted the bison or the elk on the cave. The idea being that by somehow representing the absent animals in images, it would bring about a happy hunt, that they would bring the animals into presence by invoking them through their absence in images. And when people died, think of even Tutankhamun, the pharaohs, when they were buried, 3, 4, 5,000 years ago by the Egyptians, they were painted on the sarcophagus. The coffins were their images. People were buried with effigies, representations, statues. The implication being that by preserving the person through an image, they would somehow be preserved in life. So that's the role of the going right back to the beginning of time. Now, in our own day, of course, it's the digital image, it's the technological image. But It's still the miracle of absence in presence, except instead of it being confined either to our dreams at night, when of course we're inhabiting our images, coming from the unconscious and the invisible, but also, you know, are being confined to churches where there were religious images, or museums where there are artistic images. Now we have images all the time through our screens. You know, I mean, Americans, as Time magazine recorded, you know, Americans check their iPhones 1 billion times a day.
Yeah.
You know, the figures are absolutely astounding. I mean, Facebook has 2 billion members.
Yeah.
YouTube 1.5,
Yeah.
Instagram 88 million, Snapchat 250 million, and so on. TikTok even more and counting.
Yeah.
So we're living in an age of hyperconnectivity through the image.
Yeah.
So the question is, that's wonderful. We can connect with anybody anywhere in the world. But what does it mean to our sense of embodied existence? That's the question.
Yeah.
And it's not a matter of throwing out technology, of getting rid of the digital image for the sake of the digital fingerprint of the hand. I mean, it's interesting that digital means both our handprint originally and now the digital image is digital code. But we need both. The question is, how do we live in both? And we have existed hitherto in an Anthropocene, as it's called, you know, in the contemporary parlance, where the human and the anthropos, the anthropological, has dominated nature and the world and life. And now we have come to a crisis with pandemics, with the climate crisis, with, you know, economic and industrial collapse and the whole carbon crisis, where we have to have a new relationship to the non-anthropological world, to the natural world, the animal world, the cosmic world. And this is what I call a symbiocene, from the Greek symbiosis, that we've got to work in connection with. So we don't get rid of our technology, our digital technology, but how do we bring our digital technology, which is very dominated by sight as a controlling sense, into a symbiocene where we also relate the visual to the tactile, and where instead of having single sensation, which we have through a computer screen or a digital image, we have what I call double sensation. When, as Aristotle said, you know, 2,500 years ago, in the first human psychology that we know of in Western thought, when the hand touches something, it's also, as it's tactile, it's tangible. That when your hand touches your hand, you are touching and being touched at the same time. It's double sensation. Now, that is the condition of us as incarnate beings. The danger is, in a digital age, dominated by the visual image, what's called optocentric image, that we have single sensation. We're doing the controlling, as, for example, in video games, or where we can create cities, pornography, where we can have whatever sexual fantasies exercised at our will and so on. By paying money and pressing a key on your computer, you can have control of all of these experiences. But what do you lose in the process? That's a one-way.
Well, what do you lose?
What does one lose? And it is, I think, the reciprocity principle of not only touching but being touched. And that seems to me to be very important. Of course, we need to keep the digital image, but we also need to supplement it with tactile sensation.
So just kind of playing off of that, have you heard of this Netflix documentary, The Social Dilemma?
Yes.
So did you get a chance to watch it?
I did.
So, you know, for people who may not have watched it, the central theme is this idea that the social media companies like Facebook, you know, Instagram, Twitter, whatever, all of the ones that you mentioned previously, they are, you know, as much as they claim to be, you know, the anti-evil corporations, are doing things that'll keep us on their platform more and more. And they're trying to take our data to get us to stay on more, to, you know, help get increased revenue for themselves. Could you, you know, perhaps reflect on what's going on with that?
Well, those guys know their business. As you know, having seen the social network, I think everybody should see it. To my mind, it's perhaps, well, it's prophetic in one sense, that it is arguing not to get rid of technology, but to have what one of the directors calls a humane technology, right? So I would argue that through technology, we should have the visual, of course, we should keep that, but we should also have the haptic, you know, the tactile. So we should extend its possibilities to be more in connection, in real connection with our lived experience. So I would say in that respect, humane technology is a technology that is also open to the message of redemption through reconnection with
Yeah.
with the lived world, which you find, for example, in a video game like Death Stranding. Sometimes, it's the hair of the dog that bit you. We can find in TV series like Black Mirror and Westworld, or movies like The Truman Show or Ex Machina or Her, the use of digital technology or The Truman Show to actually interrogate the limits and the potential, but also the dangers of digital technology. And all of the popular cultural programs that I've just cited, whether they be video games or TV series or movies, are all saying to us, be careful with the very idiom and medium we're now using, we're now deploying, because we could get caught in a labyrinth with no way out.
Yeah.
So that's important, to be able to use the technology, but not abuse it.
Yeah.
To be able to reuse it in a way that keeps us in connection with a real lived experience. That's the big challenge.
Yeah, and I like how you've been touching on the positive aspects of technology, because for me, I think a lot of people who criticize technology think of it perhaps in the, like this is this apocalyptic thing that we're doing, like they think of it being we're creating our own matrix. And for me, I think of it as kind of we are Icarus and we've left the tower, and it's our choice whether or not we fly too close to the sun or start to, or land.
That's right. It is our choice. I mean, the one thing I would say is a possible critique of social network is that it is a little bit too apocalyptic. There is a sense in which we're all just trapped, and what Chomsky called manufactured consent. That we're almost prefabricated to re-feed off the same cycle of data and information and social platforms and so on. And of course, it's true. If you check out a book, even on Amazon now, and you order a book, and then suddenly, whoop, as your order goes through, you get all the other books which you might like to order, and they know your search history, they know what you've been looking at, and suddenly you say, oh my gosh, I want that, I want that, I want that. Or you look at a video clip that somebody sends you, and then as you're looking at it, then 6 other alternatives come up, and again, they know what you want before you know what you want, so to speak. But I agree with you. That doesn't preclude human choice. We have a choice to become addicted to that, because it is addictive. Everybody knows first instinct in the morning. It used to be tea, then it became coffee. For some, it became cocaine, maybe, I don't know. But now it's the internet, and it's reaching for the phone. The buzz, the high, the quick sensation, the immediate connectivity. So the question is, there's lots of things that have been addictive down through the ages, from, I don't know, addictive herbs to alcohol to, power, sex. Now it's the internet. But we have a choice around that.
But I think the distinction is that with the internet, you're competing against these big companies like Facebook, who are paying the smartest minds in the world to pretty much create ways for us to stay on there and create algorithms to do, as you said, like predict what we would want next in a video or whatever. Whereas with drugs, the drug it's static. It's not going to try to lure you more than it intrinsically can, right? Or same thing with pretty much any other vice, right?
Well, I kind of agree with you that the digital image is maybe arguably the most addictive substance that has ever been invented by the human mind and the human imagination. But think about it historically. There's always been technologies. They've just been different. They've been technologies of power. Think of religion, institutional religion, governed by, cardinals, bishops, priests, priestesses, whatever. And that percolated down into the system. People were then educated through that. If you didn't belong to this particular religion, there was a huge power there too, in terms of a system, and then you think of political systems that can power is an addictive substance. So whether it's political or religious or technological, or even the drug industry, it's fine to think of drugs as natural psilocybin growing in nature, which actually are good for you, or marijuana, which arguably is very good for you, for all kinds of medical uses, as we now know, even though there was a huge taboo against it. But for all the good uses of, psychoactive, psychedelic, therapeutic pharmaceuticals, there is the pharma industry, which has its own mode of economic sort of neo-capitalist manipulation.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure that that Facebook and Microsoft and whatnot have a premium or a prerogative in terms of addictive manipulation. I think it's something basic to the human mind, and to the human being. But I think while we're more aware of what the pharmaceutical industry, or let's say an ideological industry, is doing to us politically, religiously, culturally, whatever, we seem to be more naive because we haven't developed a pedagogy of digital technology. Even if you do computer science now, there's very little philosophizing about what it actually means or does to your being. It's much more, how does it work? Rather than why does it work, and how does it affect our lives?
And so I guess what would you suggest for these tech companies to do? Should they start hiring philosophy majors and people and professionals?
Absolutely, to Jacob. This is where you and your contemporaries should all be hired. There should be, and I think there are in certain instances, people with a critical questioning conscience that know how it works. They have the savvy. They're not just Luddites saying, "Oh, we must go back to the Middle Ages," or the Greeks or the Celts, where we lived at one with nature. No, that's not going to happen. You can't turn back the tide of history or the clock of history, but you can accompany technological advances with a certain detachment, a philosophical, critical detachment, which enables you to question what you're doing, where you're going, and why you're going there. And that's what's essential, to give soul back to technology.
And I guess, my final question would be, we talk about this being the age of information. And oftentimes with the, new ages, the age of industrialization, there's a different change in character or spirit amongst the people. I think this social dilemma kind of touches upon this a little bit with talking about how now the new currency is likes and attention that you get online. Do you think that has any chance of affecting the way in which, our human essence is, or is... I guess, you're the philosophy professor. I'd love to hear your thoughts on how it could change.
That's a very good question. But something? I'm a great believer in the existentialist principle that existence precedes essence. And no matter how defined you are, and we are defined and conditioned by our DNA, by our unconscious, by our cultural, social, political, religious, and technological formation, we are still free to choose, right? And there is no essence that's ever laid down such that we are predetermined unconditionally to follow that dictum. We must be aware that we are influenced by all of these things, and nowhere more than today, when we have the technological digital network and World Wide Web in which we find ourselves. But we are still existences that make ourselves and remake ourselves according to what is given. Sartre had a beautiful line where he says, Paul Valéry, the great French modernist poet, was a petty bourgeois Parisian, but not every petty bourgeois Parisian was a Paul Valéry. In other words, how come he, out of the 2 million people who were petty bourgeois Parisians, at the end of the last century, or the 19th century, he became a poet. The others became other things. Thinkers and tailors and candlestick makers. But that's our choice, to make of what is given something for ourselves and for our community.
So do you think, just to end it off, do you think that it's a positive future that we're heading towards, or do you think that it's going to be, we're entering late stages of human former existence and human former happiness?
Well, I think that we have certainly entered a crisis. There's no doubt about it. I mean, particularly the climate crisis. This is absolutely the most important of all. But just think of it. Within a matter of days or weeks, we will be, certainly months, we will be back working with responsible governments throughout the world in terms of the Paris Climate Agreement.
Yeah.
I think we will have a vaccine for the pandemic. We will have rethought our modes of pedagogy to say, okay, we can do everything by Zoom now, but is that actually the be all and the end all of education? Or do we need to accompany that with a re-embodiment of the pedagogical relationship once again? But I do think that the crisis brought about by COVID-19 is one that has challenged us to rethink where we are going. There really was a pause button put on for the best part of 9 months or a year. You know, the gestation period of 9 months. We have been pregnant with possibilities that could be either utterly horrific or in some respects maybe salvific. And it's a double birth. And it's up to us how we develop, you know, the Siamese twins in one direction or another.
And in specifically related to technology and social media and whatnot, do you think we're going to end up like Icarus and fly too close to the sun, or will we land on our feet?
I personally think that we can land on our feet, but some will fly too close to the sun, and we will smell burning wings in the years and the months ahead. But not everybody. There'll be a Noah's Ark that'll get us to another place, I do believe.
Well, thank you for your time, Professor, and I hope you have a good finals period.
And by the way, can I just add something? In Noah's Ark, there are animals as well as humans. And that's very important. The interspecies reciprocity principle. We can never save ourselves without, at the same time, in double sensation, touching and being touched by the non-human world. And that we have forgotten at our peril. And that's going to be part of our salvation, if there is one. Reconnecting with the lived interspecies world.
Yeah. Well, thank you for your time. I think you're one of the great professors I had when I was at BC. I am curious to know how you're able to have so many thoughts and still operate within, the real world where most of us, including myself, are, thinking about not that much. But yeah, thank you for your time.
It's been a great pleasure, Jacob. Thank you.
Have a good one, Professor. Take care.
You too. Bye-bye.